Dear listeners, a new day and a new story to discuss. Today, I'm going to tell you a story that interests me. Listen and write down what you think about this situation. I'm interested in your opinions. My wedding day, anticipated as the start of a new, blissful chapter, slowly morphed into a twisted tale of subtle animosities and unspoken resentments. As I prepared to walk down the aisle, cloaked in satin and lace, I could feel Elaine's icy presence penetrating the warm, joyous ambience. Her smile, as she adjusted Mark's tie, was a masterful facade, hiding a reservoir of bitterness and control. Mark, oblivious to the undercurrents, radiated happiness. His love for me was real. I believed that. But it was entangled in a complex web spun by his mother. As we stood at the altar, exchanging vows, Elaine's sighs were barely audible, yet they resonated like dissonant chords in my heart. The reception was a grand affair, a testament to the wealthy lifestyle Mark's family led. Yet, beneath the opulence, there was an underbelly of greed and rivalry. I noticed hushed conversations between Elaine and a few select guests, their eyes darting towards me with calculated appraisal. As we sat at our table, Mark enveloped in the warmth of his family and friends, I felt like an outsider. Elaine, with her cloying affection, ensured her presence was felt at every moment. Her laughter a little too loud, her comments a bit too sharp, all under the guise of playful banter. The evening took a more sinister turn as I overheard a fragment of a conversation between Elaine and her brother, a man with a predatory gleam in his eyes. They spoke in hushed tones, their topic obscured, but the malice in their voices was palpable. I realized then that Elaine's plans for Mark, and by extension, me, were deeply rooted in her own ambition and desires. As the night progressed, I was approached by a stranger, a gentleman whose demeanor screamed of old money and darker secrets. His words were courteous, but his eyes held a warning. He cryptically advised me to be wary of the family I had married into, hinting at secrets that could shatter the veneer of this seemingly perfect family. Later, as Mark and I danced, I felt a pinch on my arm, subtle, but intentional. Turning, I met Elaine's gaze, her eyes glinting with a challenge. It was a clear message. I was in her territory now, a pawn in her game of familial chess. Our first dance as husband and wife should have been magical, but with Elaine's presence looming over us, it felt more like a prelude to a battleground. I held on to Mark, my heart heavy with a foreboding sense of dread, wondering how much of the man I loved was already lost to the shadows cast by his mother's influence. As the evening drew to a close, with guests departing and music fading, I stood by the window, watching the moon cast its ethereal glow over the gardens. I couldn't shake the feeling that my entry into this family was a mistake, a naive dive into turbulent waters rife with undercurrents I was unprepared for. My wedding day ended not with joy, but with a silent vow to myself. I would not let Elaine's cold, scheming nature dictate my future. I was determined to fight for my place in Mark's life, even if it meant standing against the daunting, manipulative matriarch who viewed me as nothing more than an obstacle in her grand design. But as I lay in bed, with Mark's steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the dark, I couldn't help but feel like a soldier stepping onto a battlefield, unarmed and outnumbered. With only my wits and resolve as my armor against the looming shadows cast by a toxic mother-in-law. Months into our marriage, the decision to buy a new house brought forth not only the challenge of finding the perfect home, but also the daunting task of navigating the tempestuous waters stirred by Elaine. Each house we viewed became a stage for her to enact her drama of disapproval and control. On one particularly crisp autumn morning, Mark and I set out to view a promising house on the outskirts of town. The charm of the neighborhood, with its tree-lined streets and quaint cafes, was overshadowed by the brooding presence of Elaine, who insisted on accompanying us. The house itself was a picturesque two-story Victorian, with a welcoming porch and an aura of serene domesticity. The realtor, a bubbly woman named Sarah, was quick to highlight its features: a spacious kitchen, a cozy fireplace, and a backyard garden that promised tranquility. As we toured the house, Elaine's critiques grew increasingly sharp. Her comments, laced with barbed undertones, left Mark tense and me fighting to maintain a semblance of composure. Her disdain was particularly evident in the master bedroom, where she scoffed at the color scheme and the view overlooking the garden. It was when we ascended to the second floor that the day took a harrowing turn. The staircase, with its polished wooden steps and ornate railing, held a certain old-world charm. I was a few steps ahead, engrossed in Sarah's description of the attic's potential, when I felt a sudden, sharp nudge at my ankle. Time slowed as I stumbled, my arms flailing for balance that eluded me. The sensation of falling was both terrifying and surreal, each moment stretching out as I cascaded down the staircase. The impact as I hit the ground was jarring, a burst of pain radiating through my body, clouding my senses with a wave of nausea and fear. Through the haze of my agony, I looked up. There, at the top of the stairs, stood Elaine. Her face, usually a carefully crafted mask of civility, was for a fleeting moment stripped of its pretense, revealing a glimpse of cold satisfaction. It vanished quickly, replaced by a look of faux concern as she rushed down the stairs, exclaiming dramatically for help. Mark was at my side in an instant, his face etched with shock and worry. The room spun as I tried to speak, to tell him what happened, but the words wouldn't come. I could only manage a weak gesture, a feeble attempt to unveil the truth behind my fall. As paramedics arrived, whisking me away on a stretcher, I caught a final glimpse of Elaine. She stood in the foyer, her demeanor one of a concerned mother, yet her eyes held a different story. They were the eyes of someone who had just laid out their cards in a high-stakes game, confident in their move. Lying in the ambulance, with the siren's wail piercing through my thoughts, I realized the full extent of my predicament. I was in a battle with an adversary whose tactics were shrouded in duplicity and malice. Elaine's act on the stairs was a declaration of war, a sinister message that she was willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain her hold over Mark and, by extension, me. As the hospital loomed into view, my mind reeled from the pain and the betrayal. I knew then that my journey within this family was going to be fraught with more danger and deceit than I could have ever imagined. But amidst the chaos of my thoughts, a resolve began to form. I would not let this go unchallenged. I would not be a passive victim in Elaine's twisted game. The battle lines were drawn, and I was ready to fight back, even if it meant uncovering truths that would shake the very foundation of the family I had married into. But first, I had to survive, to heal not just in body, but in spirit, to prepare for the storm that was undoubtedly coming. Lying in the hospital bed, encased in the sterile, white walls, the reality of my isolation enveloped me. Each day melded into the next, punctuated only by the monotonous beeping of machines and the occasional murmur of nurses outside my door. Pain was a relentless companion, but it was the ache of abandonment that cut deepest. Mark, the man who had vowed to stand by me, was absent. His absence spoke louder than any words of betrayal. The only solace in those long, empty hours was my own cascade of thoughts, replaying the incident over and over. Was Elaine's move a calculated act of malice or a mere accident? The question gnawed at me, the answer seeming as distant as the feel of sunlight against my skin. One afternoon, as I was lost in this reverie, the door creaked open. Expecting another round of medication, I turned, only to freeze at the sight of Elaine standing in the doorway, a facade of concern masking her features. "Anna, my dear, how are you feeling?" Her voice dripped with feigned sympathy, but her eyes, cold and calculating, belied her true nature. The sight of her, the cause of my agony, filled me with a mix of fear and anger. I wanted to scream, to tell her I knew what she had done, but the words caught in my throat, caged by the uncertainty of her influence over Mark. "I'm managing, Elaine." "Thank you," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, veiling the storm of emotions within. She glided closer, perching on the edge of my bed with the grace of a cat stalking its prey. "You know, Mark is just so distraught over this whole ordeal. He's been keeping himself busy to cope with the stress. You understand, don't you?" Her words, laced with poison, were meant to wound. I clenched my fists under the sheets, forcing a nod. "Of course, I understand." Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly, as if searching for a crack in my armor. "We only want what's best for you, dear. I hope you know that." The conversation, if it could be called that, was a torturous dance around truth and lies. Elaine left as abruptly as she came, leaving a wake of unease that lingered long after the door clicked shut. In the following days, a seed of determination took root within me. Mark's betrayal, Elaine's manipulation, I couldn't let them define my story. I began to plan, to strategize a way out of the web that had ensnared me. But plans need allies, and I felt desperately alone. That's when, in an unexpected twist, I received a message from an unknown number. The text was simple, yet it sent ripples through the stagnant waters of my predicament. "We need to talk. I know about Elaine. I can help. Meet me at the hospital cafe tomorrow. Be cautious." The message wasn't signed, its origin mysterious. A part of me feared a trap, perhaps another of Elaine's games. Yet, another part, fueled by desperation and hope, clung to the possibility of an ally. As night descended, I lay awake, the shadows on the walls mirroring the darkness that seemed to close in around me. The meeting tomorrow could be my chance to turn the tables, or it could plunge me deeper into this nightmare. With the morning light, I made my decision. I would go to the meeting. I would face this unknown ally or adversary. Because in the chess game that my life had become, I was done being a pawn. I was ready to move. The morning light filtered weakly through the hospital blinds, casting long, thin shadows across the room. Today could change everything. The unknown sender of the message remained a mystery, shrouded in anonymity. Was it a friend or another foe in Elaine's intricate web? My heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Using the excuse of needing fresh air, I navigated the hospital corridors, a sense of paranoia creeping over me. Every face seemed suspect, every glance potentially threatening. The hospital cafe, usually a haven of idle chatter and the rich aroma of coffee, now felt like a covert battleground. Seated at a corner table, nursing a cup of untouched coffee, I scanned the cafe. Everyone seemed absorbed in their own worlds, but in my state of heightened suspicion, they all felt like potential players in Elaine's game. A figure approached, a man in his mid-50s with a weathered face and kind eyes that seemed oddly familiar. He sat down across from me, his movements deliberate and cautious. "Anna, right?" His voice was low and steady. "I'm George. I believe we have a common adversary." George. The name took a moment to register. This was George, Mark's colleague from his father's company. Why would he reach out to me? How do you know about what's happening? My voice trembled slightly, betraying my nervousness. George leaned in, his expression grave. "Elaine is a cancer in that family. I've seen her manipulate and destroy. She's done it to the company, to her husband, and now to her son and you. I've been keeping an eye on her, waiting for the right moment to act." His words, heavy with meaning, sent a chill down my spine. It confirmed my worst fears about Elaine, but it also offered a glimmer of hope. "Why help me?" I asked, skeptical of his sudden appearance and offer. George's eyes flickered with a mix of pain and determination. "Because I owe it to Richard, Mark's father, to set things right." Elaine's manipulations led to their separation, and eventually, to the downfall of the company. Richard and I were close, and I've watched helplessly as she tore his world apart. My mind reeled at the revelation. Richard, the estranged father, a silent victim in this web of deceit. And here was George, an ally emerging from the shadows of the past. What can we do? I questioned, a sense of purpose rising within me. We expose her, George said, his voice firm. We bring her lies and manipulations into the light. I have documents, evidence of her meddling in the company, of her plans to oust Richard. We can use this to bring her down. The plan was bold, maybe even reckless, but the thought of facing Elaine on equal footing ignited a fire in me. No longer would I be the passive victim in her twisted game. But Mark. The thought of my husband, still under Elaine's spell, gnawed at me. George's expression softened. Mark is lost in his mother's web, but maybe exposing Elaine's true nature will open his eyes. It's a risk, but one worth taking. Our meeting concluded with a plan in place. As George left, he turned back with a final piece of advice. Be careful, Anna. We're playing a dangerous game. Returning to my room, I felt a new strength within me. The battle lines were drawn, and for the first time since my fall, I felt a flicker of hope. Elaine had played her hand, but now it was my turn. And with George by my side, I wasn't alone in this fight. Hours after my clandestine meeting with George, the hospital room's silence was shattered by an unexpected knock. My heart raced, thinking it might be Elaine, coming to weave more of her malicious tales. Instead, the door creaked open to reveal Richard, Mark's father, and Elaine's estranged husband. His appearance was startling, an elderly man, his face etched with the weariness of years and the burden of enduring manipulation. He walked in, a fragile figure cloaked in the strength of his resolve. His eyes, a mirror of countless untold stories, met mine with a profound sadness tinged with determination. Anna, he began, his voice shaky yet firm, I've heard about your fall and everything else. He paused, glancing down at the papers in his hand. I've had enough of Elaine's destruction, her poisonous grip on my family, our business. It's time to put an end to it. I listened, spellbound, as Richard unfolded the documents he carried. The first set was a divorce petition, meticulously prepared, aimed at severing the ties that bound him to Elaine. The second set, to my utter astonishment, was a divorce petition for Mark and me, alongside it a hefty financial agreement. I can't undo the years of manipulation and hurt, but I can give you a chance to start over, Richard said, his voice heavy with unshed tears. This is a transfer of $40 million to you. It's time that money did some good instead of feeding Elaine's greed. I was speechless, the magnitude of his gesture sinking in. This wasn't just a transfer of wealth. It was an act of rebellion against years of deceit, a father's way of dismantling the empire of lies his wife had built. But Mark? I asked, the image of my husband, still enmeshed in his mother's web, haunting my thoughts. Richard's gaze dropped, clouded with regret. I love my son, but he's chosen his path, blinded by Elaine's machinations. Perhaps losing everything will open his eyes to the truth. I hope one day he'll understand. The room fell silent, the weight of Richard's decision hanging heavy in the air. This was more than a simple act of retribution. It was a father's heartbreaking concession to the loss of his son to a manipulative spouse. As Richard left, his steps slow but purposeful, I realized the enormity of the choice before me. This offer was freedom, but it came with the price of cutting the final tie I had with Mark. The decision loomed over me, vast and daunting. I sat alone, the shadows lengthening as the day waned, the fading light mirroring the closing of a chapter in my life. Ahead lay a path fraught with uncertainty, but also brimming with the possibility of a new beginning. The game had changed, and with it, my role in this twisted narrative. In that quiet hospital room, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I made my choice. The night fell, not with a sense of ending, but with the promise of a new dawn. In the wake of Richard's departure, the hospital room seemed to hold its breath, enveloped in the magnitude of what had just transpired. His offer lay before me, not just a lifeline, but a thunderbolt poised to shatter the life I knew. The decision weighed heavily on my heart, the documents a tangible reminder of the chaos erupting around me. Before I could even begin to process the enormity of it all, the door burst open with a force that sent a jolt through the room. In stormed Elaine, her face a mask of unbridled fury, Mark trailing behind her, looking like a storm cloud of confusion and anger. What is this nonsense Richard is spewing about divorces and wills? Elaine's voice was a sharp blade, cutting through the tense air. You think you can steal what's rightfully ours? Mark's eyes, full of questions, met mine. I could see the battle raging within him, the indoctrinated loyalty to his mother clashing with the fragments of truth trying to break through. I rose, the documents in hand, strength I didn't know I possessed coursing through my veins. Richard knows everything. The greed, the manipulations, the plots. He's cutting the strings, Elaine. It's over. Elaine's laugh was bitter, tinged with disbelief. You? He's leaving it all to you? Don't be absurd. Mark is his son, his blood. Mark stood silent, the reality dawning upon him in painful waves. He looked between Elaine and me, the foundation of his world crumbling. It was then the door swung open again, this time with an air of solemn authority. Richard stepped back into the room, flanked by two stern-looking attorneys. He looked directly at Elaine, his voice resonating with a finality that echoed off the stark hospital walls. Elaine, you've turned my son against me, poisoned everything I held dear. But this ends now. His eyes then shifted to Mark. I wanted to give you everything, son. But you chose her lies over our family. I can't let you destroy what I built. The room plunged into a chaotic symphony of shouting and disbelief. Elaine's face turned a shade of red I'd never seen, her words spilling out in venomous torrents. Mark, caught in the eye of the storm, seemed to shrink, the visage of his mother's perfect son dissolving into that of a lost, confused boy. Richard's attorney stepped forward, laying out the documents with a precision that felt like the final nails in the coffin of Elaine's empire. The divorce papers for Richard and Elaine, the amended will leaving everything to me, and the divorce papers for Mark and me. Elaine lunged towards the documents, her screams filling the room, but the attorneys were quicker, their professionalism a barrier against her fury. Richard, you can't do this. This is betrayal. This is madness, she shrieked, her eyes wild. Richard, with a calm that belied the storm around him, simply shook his head. No, Elaine, this is justice. Mark, silent throughout the tempest, finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. Dad, why? Richard's gaze softened momentarily as he looked at his son. Because I hope losing it all might finally teach you what really matters in life. The room fell silent, the drama reaching its crescendo, leaving everyone to grapple with the reality unfolding before them. Elaine's world had crumbled, Mark's illusions shattered. And me? I stood there amidst the wreckage, holding the key to a new beginning, my heart a battleground of sorrow, relief, and uncharted hope. As the lawyers began to guide Elaine and Mark out, their protests fading into the sterile corridors of the hospital, I realized this was not the end, but a new, uncertain beginning. The chapter of Elaine, Mark, and their twisted schemes might be closing, but ahead lay a path filled with the unknown. I turned to face the window, the city skyline a silhouette against the twilight sky, a symbol of the vast world waiting beyond these walls. A world where, for the first time, my story was mine to write. As Elaine and Mark were led away, the latter's eyes met mine, flickering with an emotion I couldn't quite decipher. In the wake of their departure, a heavy, almost suffocating silence filled the room. Richard, who had remained composed throughout the ordeal, finally allowed a weary sigh to escape his lips, his gaze still locked on the door through which his family had just been escorted. I found myself sitting back down, the magnitude of what had just occurred sinking in. Richard joined me, his expression a complex tapestry of relief, sadness, and a deep-seated weariness. Elaine's actions are indefensible. She'll likely face prison for her fraud and manipulation, Richard murmured, almost to himself. And Mark, I hope this will be a wake-up call for him. Maybe away from Elaine's influence, he can find some semblance of redemption. As days turned into weeks, the news did indeed come. Elaine was sentenced to prison for a myriad of offenses, including embezzlement and fraud. The public trial was a media frenzy, every sordid detail of her manipulation and greed laid bare for the world to see. Mark, initially lost in the storm of his mother's downfall, began to undergo a transformation. Away from Elaine's toxic influence, he started to show signs of change. He enrolled in therapy, dealing with the years of manipulation and control. His visits to me in the hospital, initially filled with tension and unspoken questions, gradually became more open, more reflective. I never saw it. The whole time, Mark confessed during one such visit, his voice tinged with a regret so profound it almost made him seem like a stranger. She twisted everything, and I just let her. I'm sorry for everything. The bitterness and anger I had felt towards Mark slowly began to dissolve, not into forgiveness, but into a kind of detached pity. He was as much a victim of Elaine's machinations as anyone else, albeit in a very different way. With Elaine imprisoned and Mark on his path to recovery, I focused on my own healing, both physical and emotional. The divorce proceedings with Mark were quiet and uncontentious, both of us eager to close that chapter of our lives. Richard, ever the pillar of quiet strength, supported me through it all. He never once pressed me on any decision, offering instead his unwavering presence and understanding. Our relationship, built on shared pain and resilience, blossomed into a deep, familial bond, untainted by the shadows of the past. As I finally left the hospital, the world outside seemed both familiar and new. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a daily masterpiece of nature unfolding indifferently to the dramas of human lives. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few months lift slightly. Ahead of me lay a path riddled with the unknown, but I was ready. Ready to explore, to rediscover my identity, to build a life on my own terms. Elaine's imprisonment and Mark's journey towards healing were but chapters in a story that was still being written. My story, fraught with pain and betrayal, but also resilience and newfound hope, was just beginning. And as I stepped out into the cooling evening, I felt a sense of peace. In letting go of the past, I was finally free to turn the page.